The rain fell steadily over Pine Street as 12-year-old Dion hurried along the cracked sidewalk, his worn backpack pulled over his head for shelter. The neighborhood around him had seen better days. Paint peeled from the buildings and several storefronts stood empty with "For Rent" signs taped to their windows. But this was home, and Dion knew every corner of it. He was running late. His grandmother would be wondering where he was. After finishing his shift at Mr. Parker's corner store, he'd stayed an extra 30 minutes to help stack the new delivery of canned goods. The $3 extra in his pocket made it worth it, even if it meant walking home in this downpour. Dion was small for his age, with bright, observant eyes that missed very little. His jeans were a bit too short at the ankles. He'd grown 2 inches since last winter, but his sneakers were clean despite their worn edges. He took pride in that. "A man's shoes tell his story," his father used to say before the accident took him 3 years ago. As he rounded the corner toward the bus stop, Dion noticed something unusual. A sleek black car, not the kind you normally saw in this part of town, was pulled over awkwardly near the curb. Its hazard lights blinked steadily against the gray afternoon. A man stood beside it staring down at the rear tire with a look of frustration. Even from a distance, Dion could see the tire was completely flat. The man wore an expensive-looking suit now getting soaked in the rain. He held a phone to his ear, shaking his head as if receiving bad news. When he pocketed the phone with a sigh, Dion could tell help wasn't coming anytime soon. Dion hesitated. His grandmother had warned him countless times about talking to strangers, especially those who looked out of place in their neighborhood. But something about the man's defeated posture tugged at him. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Always offer a helping hand when you can. The world gets better one kindness at a time." Taking a deep breath, Dion crossed the street. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice nearly drowned by the patter of rain. "You need some help with that tire?" The man turned, surprise evident on his face. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes. For a moment he seemed taken aback by the sight of the small boy addressing him. "Oh," he said finally. "Thank you, but I've called roadside assistance. They're just backed up. It'll be at least an hour." Dion glanced at the darkening sky. "An hour's a long time to wait in this rain, sir. I can help you change it if you've got a spare." "My dad taught me how." The man studied Dion with newfound interest. "You know how to change a tire?" Dion nodded, a flash of pride warming his chest despite the cold rain. "Yes, sir. My dad was a mechanic before he passed. He showed me lots of stuff about cars." Something softened in the man's expression. "I'm sorry about your father," he said quietly. Then, after a moment's consideration, "My name's Richard, and yes, I do have a spare in the trunk. If you're sure you don't mind getting your hands dirty, I'd appreciate the help." "I'm Dion," the boy replied with a small smile, "and my hands get dirty at Mr. Parker's store all the time. It's no problem." Richard popped the trunk, revealing a tidy interior with an emergency kit and a spare tire secured in its compartment. As Dion helped him remove the spare, he noticed several folders neatly stacked to one side, along with what looked like architectural drawings peeking out from a leather portfolio. "You work with buildings?" Dion asked curiously as they set the spare tire on the ground. Richard nodded, seeming surprised by the question. "Something like that. I'm looking at some properties in this area, actually." Dion's eyebrows shot up. "For real? Not many people looking to build stuff around here anymore." "Maybe they should be," Richard replied, handing Dion the tire iron from the emergency kit. "Every neighborhood has potential." The rain had eased to a drizzle as they worked. Dion showed Richard how to loosen the lug nuts before jacking up the car. "Always a little loose first, or the wheel might spin when it's up in the air," he explained. His small hands moved with surprising confidence, muscle memory guiding him through the steps his father had demonstrated years ago. "You've definitely done this before," Richard commented, watching as Dion positioned the jack in exactly the right spot under the car's frame. "Last time was helping Ms. Wilson down the block with her old Buick," Dion said, pumping the jack handle. "Her tire wasn't flat, though. Just needed rotating." He glanced up at Richard. "You can start removing those lug nuts all the way now, sir." Richard followed Dion's instructions, clearly impressed by the boy's knowledge. As they worked together, the awkwardness between them, a wealthy older white man and a young black boy from different worlds, gradually melted away, replaced by the simple camaraderie of a shared task. "So you work at a store?" Richard asked as they carefully removed the flat tire. Dion nodded. Mr. Parker's corner store. 3 days a week after school and Saturday mornings. Just stocking shelves and sweeping up mostly. He positioned the spare tire onto the wheel hub with practiced ease. My grandma says it builds character. Your grandmother sounds wise, Richard said, handing Dion the lug nuts. You live with her? Yeah, it's just me and Grandma now, Dion replied, his voice matter-of-fact rather than sad. She works at the hospital cafeteria during the day and cleans offices at night. He began tightening the lug nuts in a star pattern, another of his father's lessons. She's real tired most days, but she never complains. Richard was quiet for a moment, watching Dion work. That's a lot of responsibility for both of you. Dion shrugged, though the simple gesture carried the weight of someone who had grown up too quickly. Lots of families like that around here. We look out for each other, though. As they lowered the car back to the ground, Richard asked about Dion's school and was surprised by the boy's enthusiasm for his classes, especially science and math. The rain had stopped completely now, and a patch of blue sky peeked through the clouds overhead. I like figuring out how things work, Dion explained, tightening the lug nuts one final time with the tire iron. My teacher, Mr. Brown, says I've got an engineer's brain. I'm not exactly sure what engineers do all day, but it sounds pretty cool. Engineers solve problems, Richard said, watching Dion work. They design solutions and build things that make people's lives better. And yes, it is pretty cool. Dion's face lit up at this description. That's exactly what I want to do. Build things that help people. With the spare tire securely in place, they packed the flat tire and tools back into the trunk. Dion's hands were smudged with dirt and grease, but he didn't seem to mind. He wiped them on his jeans, leaving dark streaks on the already worn denim. How much do I owe you for the help? Richard asked, reaching for his wallet. You saved me a long wet wait. Dion shook his head quickly. You don't owe me anything, sir. My dad always said helping people is its own payment. Richard studied the boy's face, seeming to search for something. That's a rare perspective these days, he said finally. Your father taught you well. A complicated mix of emotions crossed Dion's young face. Pride, sadness, and something stronger that might have been determination. I try to remember everything he said. Richard hesitated, then pulled out a business card instead of money. I respect your father's philosophy, but I'd still like to thank you properly. Maybe you could use a tour of an engineering firm someday. See what the job is really like. He held out the card. Have your grandmother call me if she thinks that would be all right. Dion accepted the card carefully as if it were made of glass. The heavy cream-colored paper featured a simple logo and the name Richard Winters. The title underneath read Chief Executive Officer, though of what company? Dion wasn't sure. Thank you, sir, he said, tucking the card safely into his backpack. I'll ask her. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Thank you, Dion, not just for the help with the tire, but for the reminder that there are still good people willing to help strangers. As they parted ways, Richard, climbing into his now roadworthy car, and Dion continuing his journey home, neither could have guessed how significantly their lives had just changed. One simple act of kindness on a rainy afternoon had set in motion events that would transform not just their futures, but the future of an entire community. Dion watched the black car drive away, then glanced at his watch and broke into a run. His grandmother would definitely be wondering where he was now. As he raced through puddles toward home, the weight of the business card in his backpack felt strangely significant, though he couldn't have explained why. Behind him, the clouds continued to part, letting streams of golden sunlight break through to warm the wet streets of the neighborhood he called home. The sun had fully emerged by the time Dion reached the small apartment he shared with his grandmother. Their home occupied the second floor of an old brick building that had once been a shoe factory. Despite its age, the place was spotlessly clean, with faded but carefully arranged furniture that had been lovingly maintained over the years. That you finally coming through the door? His grandmother called from the kitchen. At 62, Mae Johnson moved more slowly than she once had, but her voice remained strong and clear. I was about to call Mr. Parker to see if you were still there. Sorry, Grandma, Dion said, slipping off his damp shoes at the door. A house rule that was never bro. Ken. I stayed late to help with a delivery, and then I helped someone change a flat tire. Mae appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand and concern on her face. You did what now? A stranger? Dion hung his backpack on its designated hook and pulled out the slightly damp business card. He seemed okay, Grandma. A businessman named Richard Winters. His car got a flat near the bus stop, and I remembered everything Dad taught me about changing tires. His grandmother's expression softened at the mention of her late son. She took the card, studying it with careful eyes that had grown more far-sighted with age. She held it at arm's length to read it clearly. Chief Executive Officer, she read aloud, her eyebrows rising slightly. And what was this CEO doing in our neighborhood? He said something about looking at properties, Dion explained, following her into the kitchen where the warm smell of beans and cornbread filled the air. He gave me his card and said maybe I could tour his company someday. See what engineers do. May set the card on the counter and returned to stirring the pot of beans. Well, that was nice of him, I suppose. Her tone held the natural caution of someone who had seen enough of life to be wary of unexpected generosity. Wash up now. Dinner's almost ready. As Dion scrubbed the tire grime from his hands at the kitchen sink, he recounted the details of changing the tire. His grandmother listened quietly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You sound just like your father, she said finally, setting 2 bowls on their small table. He could talk about cars for hours, too. Dad would have fixed that flat in half the time it took me, Dion said, drying his hands. Maybe so, May agreed. But he'd be mighty proud of you for helping and for remembering what he taught you. Later that evening, as Dion finished his homework at the kitchen table, he found his thoughts drifting back to the encounter with Richard. There had been something different about the man, not just his expensive clothes or his fancy car, but the way he had listened, really listened. When Dion talked, most adults from outside the neighborhood tended to look through Dion rather than at him. But Richard had treated him with respect, like his ideas and knowledge mattered. It felt good being seen that way. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a welcome change from yesterday's rain. Dion had Saturday morning duties at Mr. Parker's store, so he was up early, wolfing down a bowl of cereal while his grandmother prepared for her weekend shift at the hospital cafeteria. Don't forget your lunch, May reminded him, placing a brown paper bag in front of him. And I put your library books in your backpack. They're due back today. Dion nodded, mouth full of cereal. The library was his favorite Saturday afternoon stop after work, one of the few places in the neighborhood that was always clean, quiet, and full of possibilities. The walk to Parker's Corner Market took 10 minutes at Dion's usual pace. The small store sat at the intersection of Pine and Walnut Streets, its fading green awning visible from blocks away. Despite newer, bigger stores opening in other parts of town, Parker's remained the heart of the neighborhood, a place where people shopped when they couldn't drive to the suburban supermarkets, where tabs were sometimes extended until payday, and where local news traveled faster than any social media. Mr. Parker was sweeping the sidewalk when Dion arrived. In his 70s now, the storekeeper had the lean build of a man who had never allowed himself to be idle. His dark skin was weathered from years of early mornings setting up sidewalk displays, and his hands bore the calluses of honest work. "Morning, Dion," he called out. "Heard you played mechanic yesterday." Dion grinned, unsurprised that Mr. Parker already knew. "News travels fast. Mrs. Washington from the beauty shop saw you. Said you were helping some rich-looking fellow in a fancy suit." Mr. Parker leaned on his broom. "Said you looked like you knew exactly what you were doing." "Just remembered what Dad taught me," Dion said with a shrug, though pride warmed his voice. The morning passed quickly with the usual Saturday tasks, restocking shelves, helping elderly customers reach items on high shelves, sweeping floors and unpacking fresh produce. Around 11, during a rare quiet moment, the bell above the door jingled. Dion looked up from the display of canned goods he was organizing, then froze in surprise. Richard Winters stood in the doorway, looking somewhat out of place in his casual weekend clothes, khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt that still managed to look expensive despite their simplicity. He carried a leather portfolio similar to the one Dion had glimpsed in his car trunk. "Good morning," Richard said, smiling when he spotted Dion. "I thought I might find you here." Mr. Parker emerged from behind the counter, curiosity evident in his expression as he looked between Dion and the visitor. "This is the man I helped with the tire, Mr. Parker," Dion explained quickly. "Mr. Winters, this is Mr. Parker. He owns the store." The two men shook hands, sizing each other up with the careful assessment of strangers from different worlds meeting on neutral ground. "Dion's one of my best workers," Mr. Parker said. "Been coming here since he was tall enough to see over the counter." Richard nodded. He certainly knew his way around changing a tire. "Impressed me quite a bit, actually." He turned to Dion. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to thank you properly for your help yesterday, and I'm back in the neighborhood today for a meeting." Before Dion could respond, the door chimed again as Mrs. Blackwell entered, her arms loaded with cloth bags for her weekly shopping. Mr. Parker excused himself to help her, leaving Dion and Richard by the canned goods. "I'm still working," Dion said, gesturing to the half-filled shelf, "but I'm done at noon." "I can wait," Richard replied, then added with unexpected humility, "if that's all right with you. I brought something I thought you might find interesting." Dion's curiosity was piqued. "What is it?" Richard patted the leather portfolio. "Some preliminary plans. I'd value your opinion on them, actually." The idea that a grown man, a CEO no less, and would value his opinion was so surprising that Dion nearly dropped the can of beans he was holding. "My opinion? Why?" "Because you know this neighborhood," Richard said simply, "and because you strike me as someone who notices things." The rest of Dion's shift seemed to crawl by. Mr. Parker kept giving curious glances toward Richard, who had settled in the small seating area by the window, where neighborhood elders sometimes played checkers. The businessman had pulled out a tablet and appeared to be reviewing documents, occasionally making notes with a stylus. When noon finally arrived, Dion quickly finished his tasks and hung up his work apron. "You be careful now," Mr. Parker murmured as he handed Dion his week's pay, $25 in cash. "Don't know what that man wants." "Yes, sir," Dion promised, tucking the money carefully into his pocket. "I'll stay in public places." Outside the store, the midday sun warmed the sidewalk. Richard suggested they walk to the small park at the end of the block, where a few benches sat in the shade of old oak trees. On the way, he asked Dion about school, which subjects he liked best, who his favorite teachers were, what he found challenging. "Science and math are my best subjects," Dion explained as they settled on a bench. The park was busy with weekend activity, children playing on the worn equipment, a group of teenagers shooting hoops on the cracked basketball court, mothers chatting while keeping watchful eyes on their little ones. "But I like history too. Mr. Lee makes it interesting, tells it like stories instead of just dates to memorize." Richard nodded appreciatively. "The best teachers do that, help you see the connections between things instead of just facts in isolation." He opened his portfolio and pulled out several large sheets of paper. "That's what I try to do in my work too, see the connections." He spread the papers on the bench between them. They were architectural drawings, sketches of a building with large windows, open spaces, and what looked like classrooms or workrooms of some kind. "What's this going to be?" Dion asked, leaning closer to examine the details. "That's partly what I wanted to ask you about," Richard replied. "I'm considering creating a technology center in this neighborhood, a place where young people could learn coding, engineering, digital design, skills that open doors to good careers. But I'd like it to be something the community actually wants and needs, not just what I think they should have." Dion's eyes widened as he studied the drawings with new understanding. "A tech center? Here, for real?" "For real," Richard confirmed, a hint of amusement in his voice at Dion's surprise. "The question is, would kids use it? Would families trust it? What would make it work for this community specifically?" For the next hour they talked. Dion shared insights about the neighborhood that surprised Richard with their perceptiveness. The transportation challenges many families faced, the need for programs that ran early mornings and evenings to accommodate parents' work schedules, the importance of including spaces where younger siblings could safely wait, while older kids participated in programs. As they talked, Richard took notes, occasionally redrawing elements of the plans based on Dion's suggestions. What had begun as a simple thank you was transforming into something neither had expected, a genuine collaboration, a bridge between two worlds that rarely connected in meaningful ways. "You've given me a lot to think about," Richard said finally, looking at Dion with newfound respect. "You have good instincts for design and for people's needs." Dion felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sunshine. For once, his ideas weren't being dismissed because of his age or where he lived. This man, this successful businessman, was actually listening to him. "Will you really build it?" Dion asked, trying not to sound too hopeful. Richard carefully rolled up the plans, his expression thoughtful. I'm strongly considering it, and if I do, he paused, seeming to make a decision. I'd like to continue getting your input if you're willing. With your grandmother's permission, of course. As they stood to leave, neither fully understood how this unexpected connection would reshape their futures. But something important had begun, something that would extend far beyond a chance encounter with a flat tire on a rainy afternoon. 2 weeks passed before Dion heard from Richard again. School had grown busier with end-of-quarter tests approaching, and between his studies and work at Mr. Parker's store, Dion had little time to wonder about the businessman and his plans for a technology center. Still, each day when he walked past the empty lot at the corner of Pine and Oak Streets, the spot Richard had mentioned, as a possible location, Dion found himself imagining a building filled with computers and curious kids. You're daydreaming again, his friend Tony said, nudging him as they walked home from school. Tony lived in the apartment below Dion's and had been his best friend since kindergarten. Thinking about that rich guy's tech center? Dion shrugged, slightly embarrassed, just wondering if he was serious or just being nice. Adults say things all the time they don't mean, Tony replied with the weary wisdom of a 12-year-old who had seen too many promises broken. Remember when the city said they were going to fix up the basketball courts last summer? Dion nodded. The courts remained cracked and uneven, with bent rims that made proper shooting nearly impossible. Just another forgotten promise to their neighborhood. Maybe you're right, Dion admitted, but he seemed different somehow. When they reached the corner store, Tony continued home while Dion went inside for his afternoon shift. Mr. Parker was on the phone, his expression unusually animated. He waved at Dion as he entered, but continued his conversation, voice low but excited. Yes, he's just walked in. Of course. Tomorrow at 4 would be fine. Yes, I'll make sure his grandmother knows. Mr. Parker hung up and turned to Dion with a look of astonishment. That was Richard Winters. He's been trying to reach you. Dion's heart jumped. Really? What did he say? He wants you and your grandmother to meet him tomorrow at his office downtown. Mr. Parker shook his head in wonder. Said he's ready to move forward with his plans and needs your input before things get finalized. Downtown? At his actual office? Dion could hardly believe it. He'd never been inside any of the gleaming skyscrapers that made up the city's skyline. Those buildings had always seemed like another world, visible from his neighborhood but not meant for people like him. That's what the man said. He's sending a car to pick you both up after school. Mr. Parker studied Dion with newfound curiosity. What exactly did you say to him when you were changing that tire? Dion shook his head, bewildered. Nothing special. Just talked about the neighborhood and stuff. That evening, explaining the invitation to his grandmother proved challenging. Mae Johnson was naturally suspicious of unexpected generosity, especially when it came from wealthy strangers. I don't understand why this man is so interested in your opinion, she said as she folded laundry, her movements precise and efficient despite her tired hands. You're 12 years old. He says I know the neighborhood, Dion explained, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor helping match socks. And he's right, Grandma. I do know what kids around here need. Nobody ever asks us, but we know. Mae paused, studying her grandson's earnest face. The expression reminded her so much of her late son that it made her heart ache. That same quiet determination, that belief that things could be better if people just tried harder. Mr. Parker vouches for this man? She asked finally. Dion nodded eagerly. He said Mr. Winters seemed genuine, and he's going to call you himself tonight to explain everything. Sure enough, Richard called that evening. Mae listened more than she spoke, asking occasional sharp questions that made Dion hold his breath. But by the end of the conversation, something had shifted in his grandmother's demeanor. She still seemed cautious, but a new curiosity had replaced her outright suspicion. Well, she said after hanging up, I suppose we're going downtown tomorrow. The car that arrived the next afternoon wasn't the sleek black sedan Richard had been driving when Dion first met him. Instead, it was a practical but new-looking SUV, driven by a friendly woman who introduced herself as Lutia, Richard's assistant. Mr. Winters is looking forward to seeing you both, she said as they navigated through after-school traffic. He's been talking about your ideas for days, Dion. Dion sat up straighter in the back seat, trying not to show how nervous and excited he felt. Beside him, his grandmother had worn her good dress, the navy blue one usually reserved for church, and had fixed her hair with extra care. Her hands, slightly swollen from years of hard work, rested in her lap, occasionally fidgeting with her old purse. The downtown skyline grew larger as they approached, glass towers reflecting the afternoon sun. Lucia turned into an underground parking garage. Beneath one of the tallest buildings, a gleaming structure of glass and steel that seemed to touch the clouds. Winters Technology Group occupies the top 10 floors, Lucia explained as they rode an elevator that moved so smoothly, it barely felt like they were moving at all. Richard's office is on 52. Dion exchanged a wide-eyed glance with his grandmother. They'd never been this high above the ground before. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped into a space that looked nothing like the offices Dion had imagined. Instead of stuffy cubicles and fluorescent lighting, the space was open and airy, with comfortable-looking work areas, plants, and large windows offering spectacular views of the city. People moved about purposefully, some in casual clothes rather than suits, many much younger than Dion expected. This way, Lucia guided them through the space. Employees glanced up curiously as they passed. Dion felt suddenly self-conscious in his school clothes, but the feeling faded when he noticed everyone was smiling warmly at them. Richard's office wasn't what Dion expected either. Rather than an imposing desk and throne-like chair, the large corner room held a round table surrounded by comfortable chairs, a wall of bookshelves, and another wall covered entirely in whiteboard material filled with diagrams and notes. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking view of the city, and from this height, Dion could see all the way to his neighborhood in the distance. Richard stood as they entered, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "Mrs. Johnson, Dion, thank you so much for coming." He stepped forward to shake May's hand. Then Dion's. "I hope the ride was comfortable." "Very nice." "Thank you," May replied, her voice polite but reserved. She was taking in the office, the obvious signs of wealth and success. With carefully neutral expression, "Please sit down." Richard gestured to the table where folders and what looked like architectural models were arranged. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Lucia can bring whatever you'd like." Once they were settled with drinks, water for Dion and tea for his grandmother, Richard didn't waste time getting to the point. "After our last conversation, Dion, I took your suggestions to my design team," he said, opening one of the folders to reveal updated drawings of the technology center. "They were impressed, as was I, with your insights. We've incorporated many of your ideas into the revised plans." For the next 20 minutes, Richard walked them through the designs. The building was beautiful but practical. 2 stories with large windows, flexible spaces that could be reconfigured based on different needs, a computer lab, workshops for hands-on projects, and even a small cafeteria. "We've adjusted the hours to include early morning and evening programs, as you suggested," Richard explained to Dion, "and added this smaller space here for younger siblings, with appropriate activities and supervision." May leaned forward, her initial reserve softening as she studied the plans. "This is in our neighborhood? On Pine Street?" "Yes," Richard confirmed. "We've already secured the land. In fact, that's part of why I asked you here today. We're ready to move forward, but before we do, I wanted to discuss something important with both of you." He took a breath, suddenly seeming less like a powerful CEO and more like someone about to take a risk. "Mrs. Johnson, your grandson made quite an impression on me, not just his kindness in helping with my tire, but his intelligence, his insights about his community, and his clear interest in engineering and problem-solving." May nodded, a hint of pride warming her expression. "He takes after his father that way." "I'd like to offer Dion a role in this project," Richard continued. "A paid position as a youth advisor to our community outreach team. He would work directly with our designers and program developers to ensure we're creating something that truly serves the neighborhood's needs." Dion's mouth fell open. "A job? A real job with your company?" Richard smiled. "A real job, though only part-time and scheduled around your school hours, of course. Education comes first, that's non-negotiable." "Blah." May's eyes narrowed slightly. Why our Dion? There must be plenty of kids you could ask." It was a fair question, and Richard seemed to appreciate her directness. "When I got that flat tire, I was actually leaving a community meeting where I'd been trying to explain my ideas for the technology center. People were suspicious, assuming I had ulterior motives or wouldn't follow through. Then Dion came along, this young boy who stopped to help a stranger who knew exactly what to do, who talked about his neighborhood with such care and understanding. Richard leaned forward. "Mrs. Johnson, your grandson bridges worlds in a way few people can. He sees possibilities where others see only problems. That's a rare gift." May studied Richard's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she turned to Dion. "What do you think?" Dion had been sitting in stunned silence, trying to process what was being offered. I'd really like to do it," he said finally. "If you think it's okay." Something in his grandmother's face softened completely then. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I think your father would be very proud of what you're becoming." Richard watched their exchange with a look of satisfaction. "There's one more thing," he added, sliding another folder across the table. "This isn't contingent on Dion accepting the position. It's a separate matter entirely." May opened the folder cautiously. Inside was information about a scholarship program, one that would provide full funding for Dion's education through college if he maintained good grades and continued his interest in STEM fields. "This isn't charity," Richard said quickly, seeing May's expression grow guarded again. "It's an investment in talent. My company does this for several promising students each year. Dion would be joining a program that already exists." As they discussed the details, the sun began to set outside the vast windows, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Dion found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the view of his neighborhood in the distance. From up here, the familiar streets looked different, not smaller or less important, but connected to everything else, part of a larger whole he hadn't fully understood before. Something was changing, not just for him, but perhaps for his whole community, and it had all begun with a flat tire on a rainy afternoon. The first day Dion walked into Winter's technology group wearing his new ID badge, he felt like he was dreaming. 6 weeks had passed since the meeting in Richard's office, and in that time, his life had transformed in ways he was still trying to understand. The youth advisor position came with a proper salary, not just pocket money like his job at Mr. Parker's store, but actual paychecks deposited into a bank account that Richard had helped his grandmother open for him. The arrangement was that he would work 10 hours a week, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons after school, and Saturday mornings. Mr. Parker had been understanding about Dion cutting back his hours at the store, especially when he learned about the opportunity. "Always knew you were meant for bigger things," the old shopkeeper had said, patting Dion's shoulder. "Just don't forget us little folks when you're running the whole show someday." Now, standing in the elevator heading up to the 48th floor, not Richard's executive suite, but the floor where the community projects team worked, Dion took deep breaths to calm his nerves. His reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a boy transformed not by fancy clothes, though his grandmother had insisted on buying him 2 new shirts for the job, but by the quiet confidence beginning to take root in his posture. Lucia was waiting when the elevator doors opened. Her warm smile immediately put Dion at ease. "Ready for your first day?" she asked, leading him through the open workspace. "I think so," Dion replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "What exactly will I be doing?" "Today you'll meet the team and get oriented to our system," Lucia explained. "But your main job will be to review program plans, test educational content, and give feedback from a student's perspective. We want to make sure what we're designing actually works for the kids it's meant to serve." She led him to a glass-walled conference room, where 4 adults sat around a table covered with laptops, tablets, and notebooks. The conversation paused as Dion entered, and 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him with interest. "Everyone, this is Dion Johnson, our youth advisor," Lucia announced. "Dion, meet the Pine Street Technology Center core team." A tall man with a neatly trimmed beard stood first, extending his hand. "Miguel Vasquez, Education Program Director. Richard has told us a lot about you, Dion. We're excited to have your perspective on the team." One by one, the others introduced themselves. Grace Chen, the architect, David Washington, the Community Outreach Coordinator, and Priya Patel, the Technology Curriculum Developer. Each of them spoke to Dion not with the condescending tone adults often used with children, but with the respectful interest of colleagues. "We've been developing the initial program offerings for the center," Priya explained, sliding a tablet toward Dion. We'd love your thoughts on which of these would be most interesting to students in your neighborhood. For the next 2 hours, Dayon found himself in a conversation unlike any he'd ever experienced at school. The adults asked questions and then truly listened to his answers. They took notes when he spoke. They asked follow-up questions that showed they valued his input. When he suggested that coding classes might be more appealing if they focused on game development first, Priya's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "That's exactly the kind of insight we need," she said. "We've been approaching this from an adult perspective, thinking about future career skills. But you're right. Starting with something fun like games would get kids in the door." By lunchtime, Dion's initial nervousness had faded. The team ordered in sandwiches, and as they ate, the conversation shifted to Dion himself, his interests in science and engineering, his favorite subjects at school, his thoughts on what made learning exciting versus boring. "You know," Miguel said thoughtfully, "we should arrange for Dion to visit the STEM Academy downtown. It might be a good fit when he starts high school in a couple of years." Dion nearly choked on his sandwich. The STEM Academy was the most prestigious science-focused school in the city. Kids from his neighborhood didn't go there. It was for wealthy families or the rare scholarship student with perfect grades. "I don't think I could get in there," he said, trying not to sound disappointed at the very idea. "Don't be so sure," David replied. "Richard mentioned you're getting straight A's in math and science. With a recommendation from Winter's Technology Group and your natural abilities, you'd be a strong candidate." The thought followed Dion through the rest of the day as he toured the department, learned how to use the company's communication software, and sat in on a design meeting for the Technology Center's computer lab. By the time Lucia escorted him back to the elevator at 5 o'clock, his mind was buzzing with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider before. "So," Lucia asked as they waited for the elevator, "how was your first day?" Dion grinned. "Best job ever." Over the next few months, as spring turned to summer, the empty lot on Pine Street transformed. Construction crews arrived, and day by day the technology center took shape. Dion often stopped to watch the progress on his way home from school, sometimes joined by curious neighborhood kids who peppered him with questions. "Is it true they're going to have robots we can build?" asked Tony one afternoon as they watched workers installing large windows on the second floor. "And 3D printers," Dion confirmed. "And a whole room of computers with fast internet." Word spread throughout the neighborhood. At first, some adults were skeptical, whispering about gentrification and outsiders. But David Washington, the community outreach coordinator, was skilled at his job. He organized meetings at the local church, invited community feedback, and made sure local businesses were involved in the construction and planning. Slowly, suspicion gave way to cautious optimism. Dion's grandmother noticed the change in him before anyone else. The way he stood taller, spoke more confidently, dreamed bigger. One evening, as they washed dishes together, Dion washing, May drying, she broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Richard Winters stopped by the hospital cafeteria today," she said casually, focusing on drying a plate. Dion looked up in surprise. "He did? Why?" "Said he was visiting someone and thought he'd say hello." May placed the dry plate in the cabinet. "But I think he really came to talk to me about you." Dion's hands stilled in the soapy water. "What about me?" "He's offered me a position at his company," May said, her voice carefully neutral. "Administrative assistant in the Community Programs Division. Better pay than the hospital, better hours too. No more night shifts cleaning offices." "Grandma, that's amazing." Dion's face split into a wide grin, but it faded when he saw her serious expression. "Isn't it?" May sighed, setting down her dish towel. "I'm not sure, baby. Part of me wonders if this is just charity because of you. I've never worked in an office. Don't have the education for that kind of job." "But you're super organized," Dion protested. "You practically run the hospital cafeteria already, the way Mrs. Taylor always asks you to handle the scheduling and inventory." A small smile tugged at May's lips. "That's what Richard said too. Apparently you've been telling him about my exceptional organizational skills." Dion ducked his head, slightly embarrassed. "Well, it's true." May cupped his chin, lifting his face to meet her eyes. "I'm proud of you, Dion. Not just for this job or the opportunity, but for the way you've handled it all. Your daddy would be so proud too." Tears unexpectedly pricked at Dion's eyes. The mention of his father still had that effect sometimes. A sudden sharp ache that caught him off guard. Do you think he'd like Richard? May considered this. Your father was a good judge of character, and yes, I think he would. Richard Winters seems to be that rare thing, a powerful man who remembers where he came from. Where did he come from? Dion realized he knew surprisingly little about Richard's background, despite all their interactions. That's the interesting part, May said. He told me today. Grew up not so different from you. Single mother, tough neighborhood on the south side. Got a lucky break when a teacher noticed his talent for computers. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The parallels weren't lost on Dion. Was that why Richard had taken such an interest in him? Not pity, but recognition? The Technology Center's grand opening was scheduled for the last Saturday in August, just before the new school year began. The entire neighborhood turned out for the event, drawn by the promise of free food, music, and tours of the gleaming new facility. Dion arrived early with his grandmother, who looked years younger in her new outfit, her hair freshly done at Mrs. Washington's beauty shop. The stress lines that had marked her face for as long as Dion could remember seemed softer somehow, less deeply etched. Richard met them at the entrance, dressed more casually than Dion had ever seen him in a polo shirt and khakis. The guests of honor, he said warmly, shaking May's hand and giving Dion a light pat on the shoulder. Ready for the big reveal? Inside, the building exceeded even Dion's expectations. The computer lab gleamed with new equipment. The workshop spaces were stocked with tools and materials, and the walls were adorned with vibrant artwork created by local students. Everything from the furniture to the lighting had been chosen with care, creating spaces that felt both professional and welcoming. As community members filtered in, their faces registered the same amazement Dion had felt on his first visit to Richard's company. The surprise of seeing something so beautiful, so state-of-the-art in their own neighborhood. Mr. Parker arrived, leaning on his cane but moving with more energy than Dion had seen in months. Quite something, isn't it? The old shopkeeper said, gazing around the main hall. Never thought I'd see the day. When it came time for the official ribbon cutting, Richard surprised everyone by calling Dion to the front. This center exists because of this young man, Richard announced to the gathered crowd, his hand on Dion's shoulder. Not just because he helped me with a flat tire on a rainy day, but because he showed me what was possible when we truly listened to the people we aim to serve. Richard held out the ceremonial scissors. I think it's only right that Dion should cut the ribbon. With trembling hands, Dion accepted the oversized scissors. As cameras flashed and the crowd cheered, he made the cut, officially opening a facility that would change not just his life, but the lives of countless kids in his neighborhood for years to come. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Richard pulled Dion aside for a quiet moment. I have something to ask you, Richard said, his expression unexpectedly serious. The Technology Center needs a name. The board suggested naming it after me or the company, but that didn't feel right. Dion nodded, understanding. The center belonged to the community, not to Winters Technology Group. I'd like to name it after your father. Richard continued softly. The Johnson Technology Center. A tribute to the man who taught his son to help strangers and to remember what he learned. Dion stared at Richard, momentarily unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Finally, he managed to whisper, My grandma would really like that. Is that a yes? Richard asked. Dion nodded, blinking back tears. Yeah, that's a yes. 3 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. The Johnson Technology Center became the beating heart of the neighborhood, a place where young people gathered after school to learn, create, and imagine futures that once seemed out of reach. And no one's future had changed more dramatically than Dion's. Now 15, Dion had grown several inches taller. His voice had deepened and a new confidence marked his movements. But the biggest changes weren't physical. They were in the care, opportunities that had opened before him and the way he saw himself in the world. The morning of his first day at the STEM Academy dawned clear and bright. Dion stood before the mirror in his room, adjusting the collar of his new button-down shirt. The prestigious school didn't require uniforms, but his grandmother had insisted on buying him new clothes for the occasion. You look just like your father, May said from the doorway, her voice catching slightly. She'd aged in the past 3 years too, but in a gentler way. The better job hours meant more sleep, less physical strain. The worry lines around her eyes had softened, though they would never disappear completely. Do you think I'm ready for this place? Dion asked, unable to keep the nervousness from his voice. Despite his excellent grades and the glowing recommendation from Richard Winters himself, part of him still feared he wouldn't measure up at a school where most students came from wealthy families and exclusive private middle schools. More than ready, May assured him, stepping into the room to straighten his already straight collar. "You've earned this, Dion, every bit of it." A horn beeped outside Richard's car. Though Dion now had a bus pass that would take him to the downtown school, Richard had insisted on driving him personally on this first day. For luck, he'd said when he offered, though Dion suspected it was also to make sure he actually went through with it instead of losing his nerve. Richard stood beside his car when they came outside, looking much the same as when Dion had first met him 3 years ago, except now his salt and pepper hair had a bit more salt than pepper. He wore a casual suit, no tie, and sunglasses that he removed as Dion approached. "Big day," Richard said simply, giving Dion's shoulder a squeeze. "Ready?" Dion nodded, trying to project more confidence than he felt. He hugged his grandmother goodbye, promised to text her at lunch, and climbed into the passenger seat of Richard's car. As they drove away from the neighborhood, Dion found himself looking back, taking in the familiar streets with new eyes. There was Mr. Parker's store, freshly painted last spring when the old shopkeeper finally had enough money saved for renovations. There was the park where he and Richard had first discussed the technology center plans. And there was the center itself named for his father, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. "Penny for your thoughts?" Richard asked, glancing sideways at Dion's contemplative expression. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Dion replied. 3 years ago, I didn't even know what a CEO was. Now I'm going to a school I never thought I'd see the inside of, except maybe on a field trip." Richard smiled. Life can change direction in an instant. Sometimes it just takes one moment, like a flat tire on a rainy day. The STEM Academy was housed in a historic building downtown, its red brick exterior contrasting with the modern glass skyscrapers surrounding it. Inside, however, the facilities were cutting-edge. Laboratories equipped with the latest scientific instruments, computer labs with technology Dion had only read about, and classroom spaces designed for collaboration and innovation. As Richard walked him to the main office to meet the principal, Dion noticed other students staring. He was one of only a handful of black students in the hallways, and he could feel the weight of curiosity in their glances. "They're wondering who you are," Richard murmured, noticing Dion's discomfort. "By next week, they'll know you're the kid who's been helping design curriculum at the Johnson Center, the one who coded that virtual reality program the 8th graders tested last spring. Or they'll think I'm just here because of you," Dion replied, voicing the fear that had lingered despite his accomplishments. Richard stopped walking, turning to face Dion directly. "Listen to me. Your test scores got you in here. Your grades, your projects, your recommendations from teachers who were impressed by your work. I opened a door, that's all. You walked through it on your own 2 feet. Before Dion could respond, the principal's office door opened, and a woman with a warm smile and sharp eyes greeted them. "Mr. Winters, right on time. And you must be Dion. Welcome to the academy. We've been looking forward to meeting the young man behind the community coding program we've heard so much about." The principal, Dr. Rivera, spent 30 minutes with them, outlining the school's expectations and opportunities. She spoke directly to Dion, not to Richard, treating the teenager with the respect usually reserved for adults. By the time they finished, first period was about to begin. "I should get going," Richard said, checking his watch. "Board meeting at 10. He extended his hand formally to Dion. "Mr. Johnson, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to hearing about your first day." Dion shook the offered hand, suddenly aware of how far they'd both come from that rainy afternoon 3 years ago. "Thank you, Mr. Winters, for everything." As Richard turned to leave, Dr. Rivera smiled at Dion. "He believes in you very much. Now let me introduce you to your student guide for the day." The door went peen to reveal a boy about Dion's age with curly hair and glasses. "This is Alex Chen. He'll show you around today, help you find your classes." Alex grinned, extending a hand. "Hey, Dr. Rivera says you're the one who designed that VR program for the Johnson Center? That's seriously cool. I tried it when my coding club visited last semester." Dion blinked in surprise. "Your coding club came to our center?" "Yeah, we do joint projects sometimes. That's why I volunteered to be your guide. I wanted to pick your brain about how you handled the physics engine in that simulation." As the boys left the office together, Already deep in conversation about coding and virtual reality, Dr. Rivera watched with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of connection the school hoped to foster, students learning from each other across different backgrounds and experiences. Dion's first semester at the STEM Academy passed in a blur of challenging classes, new friendships, and opportunities he'd never imagined. He joined the robotics team, where his practical mechanical knowledge, learned from his father and honed at the technology center, complemented the theoretical knowledge of his teammates. Together, they built a robot that won the regional competition and qualified for nationals. His friendship with Alex deepened as well. Though they came from vastly different backgrounds, Alex's parents were both doctors living in an exclusive suburb. They shared a passion for technology and a drive to create things that mattered. Through Alex, Dion met other students who looked past his neighborhood and background to see his talents and ideas. Not everything was easy. There were teachers who seemed surprised when he excelled and students who made assumptions based on where he lived. But for every difficult moment, there were triumphs that confirmed he belonged. One crisp fall afternoon, as leaves swirled across the school courtyard, Dion sat with his laptop, putting the finishing touches on a presentation for his engineering design class. He'd chosen to focus on accessible technology for senior citizens, inspired by watching his grandmother struggle with her new smartphone. "Working hard or hardly working?" a familiar voice asked. Dion looked up to see Richard standing there bundled against the autumn chill. "Mr. Winters, what are you doing here?" Dion closed his laptop, surprised and pleased by the unexpected visit. Richard sat beside him on the bench. "Board meeting ran long. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're settling in." He nodded toward the laptop. "New project?" "Yeah, for engineering design. It's about making technology more accessible for older people." Dion hesitated, then added, "Actually, I got the idea from watching Grandma with her phone. Made me think about all the seniors at the center who want to learn technology but get frustrated." Richard's expression warmed with interest. "That's a growing market with real needs. Mind if I take a look?" For the next half hour, they discussed Dion's project, with Richard offering suggestions from his industry experience, while Dion explained his user-centered approach. It was a conversation between colleagues more than mentor and student, a subtle but significant shift in their relationship. As the afternoon light began to fade, Richard checked his watch reluctantly. "I should let you get back to work. But before I go, I wanted to share some news. The Johnson Center model has been so successful that the board has approved funding for 2 more centers in other neighborhoods." "Really? That's amazing." Dion's face lit up with genuine excitement. "There's more," Richard continued. "We want to establish a youth advisory board for all 3 centers, and we'd like you to chair it. Paid position, of course. More responsibility, but also more opportunity to shape the program's future." Dion sat back, momentarily overwhelmed. "You're offering me a promotion?" Richard laughed. "I suppose I am. You've earned it." "Dion, the center's success is largely due to your input and the connections you've helped build between the neighborhood and the company." As they discussed the details of the new position, Dion found himself thinking about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. A flat tire, a rainy day, a simple offer of help. How different both their lives might have been if he'd just kept walking that afternoon. Later, as Richard drove him home, they passed through downtown, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. From this vantage point, Dion could see both worlds he now inhabited. The gleaming skyscrapers of the business district where ambition and innovation drove constant change, and the familiar neighborhood streets where community and history provided roots and meaning. "Something on your mind?" Richard asked, noticing Dion's thoughtful expression. "Just thinking about connections," Dion replied. "How one small thing can link people who might never have met otherwise." Richard nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "The most important innovations aren't always technology, Dion. Sometimes they're the bridges we build between communities, between generations, between people who have different experiences but shared values." As they pulled up in front of Dion's apartment building, May was waiting outside, having received Dion's text that Richard was dropping him off. She waved, her smile visible even in the gathering dusk. "You know," Dion said, gathering his backpack. "My dad used to say that a man's character shows in how he treats people who can't do anything for him in return." I think he would have liked knowing that the flat tire brought you into our lives. Richard's expression softened with rare emotion. The honor was mine, Dion, truly. He extended his hand. Partners? Dion took the offered hand. No longer the hesitant 12-year-old, but a young man growing into his potential. Partners. As Dion walked toward his grandmother, he knew that the journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness was far from over. Ahead lay challenges and opportunities he couldn't yet imagine. But one thing was certain. He would face them with the same spirit that had led him to stop and help a stranger on a rainy afternoon 3 years ago. Because sometimes the smallest actions reveal the greatest character, and sometimes an unexpected flat tire is actually the first step on a remarkable journey.